Hello, friends. I'm Olivia Mattis, delighted to welcome you today on behalf of the Sousa Mendes Foundation. Thank you for spending another one of your Sundays with us. Today's program is a bit of a departure from what we normally present. We're presenting pure fun today. This is a program of a hidden Jewish history of things in your everyday life. Who doesn't know about comic books and comic book heroes? Well, you're in for an eye-opening experience today. We have three speakers who are going to present three different aspects of this history, and that is the history of comic book creators, in other words, the Jewish history of comic book creators, comic book heroes themselves who are Jewish or have a Jewish background, and then the different connections that comic books have to our telling of the Holocaust. Today's moderator is Mark Z.AID, who is a Washington, D.C. based attorney. He's repeatedly named a best lawyer in Washingtonian Magazine. He's also an avid comic book collector, and he wrote the preface to the graphic novel Whistleblower by Raphael Medoff, one of our other speakers. In 2017, Mark Z.AID co-founded a nonprofit law firm that provides pro bono legal representation to whistleblowers, particularly in the national security arena. So important. He's the grandson of the late Rabbi David Max Eichhorn, who with U.S. forces liberated Dachau Concentration Camp. And he co-edited the book, The GI's Rabbi, World War II Letters of Rabbi David Max Eichhorn. And I can't wait to do a program just on that. So Mark will moderate today's proceedings. He will introduce his co-panelists, and now I will give him the floor. Mark, take it away.
Thank you, Olivia. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. We have a very exciting presentation. My other two speakers I have known and been friends with for many years and have presented this topic or related topics on it. So you're in for a real treat to talk about essentially characters from your childhood, all of our childhoods, that many of which, but not all, are still around today. So the only thing I'm going to say about my background, besides that I have my Iron Man shirt on that can't really be seen in here, is I have combined my legal work with my comic book work. Not only do I buy and sell comic books as a comic book dealer and advise the Overstreet Price Guide, which is the price guide in this, I represent a lot of people, artists and writers and comic book companies. It's a really interesting way to combine the two. But I'm going to start first by introducing my two other co-panelists. I'm going to start first with Danny Fingerhoff. Danny goes way back in comic books. He's a former editor at Marvel Comic Books, and he'll talk about quite a number of those heroes and the creators. He also consulted on some of the movies. He has written comic books himself, and he is the author, and he speaks on many topics relating to this, such as Disguised as Clark Kent, Jews, Comics, and the Creation of the Superhero, available on Amazon. Or many people will know Stan Lee, A Marvelous Life. We'll talk more about Stan as well. And then I'll speak. Danny's going to talk about the founding and creators of the comic book industry and the connections to Judaism. I'll talk more about the characters and who is and who is not Jewish and how that worked out. And then we'll turn to Dr. Raphael Medoff, who has written a phenomenal book called We Spoke Out, Comics and the Holocaust, also available on Amazon. Some of what is in this book will be talked about in Raphael's presentation about how the Holocaust has been dealt with in comic books over the decades. And Olivia mentioned his latest work, which is Whistleblowers, Four Who Fought to Expose the Holocaust to America, which I had the honor and privilege of writing the introduction for. So with that, Danny, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mark. And just I want to thank the Sousa Mendez Foundation for inviting me, and especially Olivia Mattis, Mark Z.AID, Matthew Spern, and anybody I've forgotten. But yes, this the comic story is in many ways a very Jewish story. Comics had been around. There were compilations of newspaper comics that started coming out in the 20s and 30s. But the killer app for comics, really, the thing that put comics on the map and superheroes in particular, was Superman, who debuted in Action Comics #1. Came out in April '38, although it was cover dated a couple of months later. And that, although it may seem we've seen this a million times, to see a character holding and smashing a car and people running in fear and amazement was a big thing. Next, please. And Superman was created by these two. Here they're already adults, but when they were teenagers, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, who lived in the Glenville neighborhood of Cleveland. Their parents were immigrants, Eastern European Jewish immigrants, and Jerry and Joe were friends at Glenville High School, where again a lot of young Jewish people who went on to become prominent in various aspects of the arts and sciences went. They had this Superman idea kicking around, and finally, after actually having it rejected, they sold it famously for $130, and it became an enormous hit overnight. Next, please. Siegel and Schuster, but especially Siegel, were really of their time as very progressive, FDR, liberal Jewish thinking people, or forward thinking Jewish people. And Superman was a crusader for social justice, very often not just fighting bank robbers or train robbers or whatever, but rooting out corruption, senators who were bought, men who abused their wives, crooked industrialists. It was a very much of its time, and Superman was an instant hit, and obviously we still know who he is. Next, please. So Superman was a product, although of course much was happening with fascism, uh, Hitler and Mussolini and so on in Europe. Um, Batman came out again, cover dated May, probably come out in March or so of 1939 in the figurative shadow of Kristallnacht. And so the world of Batman, although Superman had kind of a sunny, can do, positive attitude, and the city of Metropolis was very bright and optimistic seeming, Batman's Gotham City was very dark. And next, please. It was created by these two, again, not maybe a little older than teenagers, but Bob Kane, who was born Robert Kahn, and Milton Bill Finger, who's often he often gets overlooked in the histories. Although lately he's been gotten the credits. These were two young Jewish men who lived near the Grand Concourse in the Bronx. They'd been to DeWitt Clinton High School, which was the produced prominent Jewish creators again in all sorts of fields, and comics was one of them. And they would talk about and come up with their Batman story sitting in Poe Park, which is right off the Grand Concourse in the Bronx. Next, please. So again, many of the publishers were Jewish, as were the creators, and in this particular case, a guy named Martin Goodman was the publisher of Timely Comics, which we today know as Marvel Comics. And they had success with a character called the Human Torch, who was created by a guy who went by the pen name Carl Burgos, but his name was Max Finkelstein. Bill Everett, who claimed to be a descendant of William Blake, so probably not Jewish, but he created the Submariner. And then, along with some other heroes, Captain America was the first really big hit for Timely Comics. And this issue came out um, just it's dated March 41, but it really came out December 1940, a year before Pearl Harbor. And certainly on this page, here is the creators. Next page, please. Joe Simon and Jack Kirby advocating, along with publisher Goodman, for American intervention in the war. And punching Hitler could not be um, a more blatant and in your face expression of that point of view, it's unlikely Hitler was going to sue them. Next, please. In the origin of Captain America, which is in that same issue, skinny Steve Rogers, who's from the Lower East Side, although the name Steve Rogers was at least not canonically Jewish, but may as well have been Jewish, is given the super soldier serum by a Professor Reinstein. So I think you could probably figure out between the way he's drawn and his name that it was supposed to be an analog to Albert Einstein, and Cap was astonishingly popular. Next, please. At the same time, comic books are catching on. They were very popular. Every publisher wanted to figure out a way to cash in on the comic book phenomenon and the superhero phenomenon. This gentleman is Will Eisner. He grew up in the Bronx and Brooklyn, and he created a character. And so Eisner was very much an innovator, and a lot of things we think of as comics were developed by him. Next, please. His best known work of his first phase is a character called the Spirit. And the Spirit, with which, by the way, Jules Pfeiffer, who recently passed away, was, as a teenager, started his career as Eisner's assistant. And Eisner, although the city was called Central City, a lot of it was about New York types and, dare I say, Jewish types. This is a story called 10 Minutes, and it's about a kind of down and out, and down on his luck loser in what may as well and be a Bronx tenement. And he kind of is in a bad mood. And 10 Minutes, co-written by Eisner and Pfeiffer, is you can almost smell the Bronx streets. You can you can smell the latkes. And these stories were very powerful. And Eisner was an artist. So the Spirit appeared in newspaper inserts. And was influential on a whole raft of artists. Next, please. And Eisner then took a break in his career to do instructional comics for the military and for corporate work. But in the mid and late 70s, he figured out that the audience had grown up reading comics, wanted more mature, more sophisticated material, and that's what he wanted to do. And he came back to comics and was one of the inventors of what we now call the graphic novel. The first one was A Contract with God, that came out in 1978, and it was really the beginning of 25 years of Eisner making his mark as, in essence, the Bernard Malamud of comics. His stories were largely about tenement life in the Bronx that he grew up in. The last graphic novel he was working on, just literally weeks or even less before he passed away in 2005, was The Plot, the secret protocol, the secret story, the protocols of the Elders of Zion. Eisner was very concerned about the resurgence of anti-Semitism in general, and in particular, the resurgence of this anti-Semitic forgery, and that was his last work. Next, please. Contract with God inspired many graphic novelists of all kinds, but especially Jewish graphic novelists, and most famously Art Spiegelman's Mouse, which was his story of his father's Holocaust experiences and surviving the Holocaust, and as well as Spiegelman's own relationship with a survivor father and how it affected his life, all told in metaphors of what we ordinarily assume associate with funny animal comics. Next, please. So the Marvel comics started in Marvel comics that we think of, the ones that fuel the movies, really started in 1961. You'll see later on a cover of the first Fantastic Four, and of course they have a big movie coming out this summer. But the FF in Marvel Comics, especially, World War II never ended. And so this comic came out in the mid 60s, and the FF fought a character called the Hate Monger, who was, just to see you look at him, he was somebody who spread hate, especially resentment and hatred of immigrants who are not pure blood Americans. A story, drawn by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, who were two Jewish guys, and the villain was the Hate Monger, who turned out to, I'll spoil the story for you. It's only 65 years later. turned out to be either Hitler or a Hitler double. This is Lee and Kirby in their heyday and when they were on speaking terms, and a few different hairstyles variants by Stan Lee before he discovered toupees and hair plugs. But that's Lee and Kirby at the height of their accomplishments with Marvel. Next, please. Spider-Man, never canonically Jewish, but he had many of the characteristics of a smartass, wisecracking Jewish New York teenager who probably read too much Mad Magazine. Next, please. In the movies and Spider-Man Across the Multiverse, a version of Peter Parker, next please, seems to be breaking a glass at a Jewish wedding. So at least in that universe, Spider-Man's Jewish. Next please. Captain America, who you'd seen in the war, was frozen in an iceberg. It's complicated. He came back after a lapse of many years in the early '60s in Marvel, and was a huge hit. Then again, next please. And Caps was used as a metaphor, really, for whether intentionally or not, for Holocaust survivors. Everybody Cap knew either had died or had grown older while he had stayed young. And he says, I am not lucky enough to forget forever, to forget that I was once the man the world called Captain America. Marvel milked that for years, wrote some brilliant soap opera type stories, but Cap really a metaphor for survival.
Awesome. Thank you, Danny. Appreciate that. You'll see, folks, as we have to go a little bit quick through some of them so we can save time for your questions. All three of us could talk for hours on even just one of these slides. So the topic is intense. So if we want to bring up my slides now, and I am going to talk about how the characters have been influenced by it. As my introduction was, so my grandfather was a rabbi, and I speak on comic book issues all the time. That's me doing a mock trial at San Diego Comic-Con. Next one. So, did you know they were Jewish? Because comic books, as Danny said, basically started in the 1930s for what we now know today as modern comic books. Next. But were they Jewish? So the X-Men, which were one of Kirby and Lee's initial comics that came out in '63, no real indication for many, many years of any Jewish connections. But next slide. 20 years later, almost 2 decades, we learn that at least at first, the main antagonist who was on the cover of X-Men 1, Magneto, is a Holocaust survivor. We don't have specifics yet, but he talks about how his family had been slaughtered during the war. Next. We now later learn that he actually was in Auschwitz. We have the tattoo, as we all unfortunately know what that signifies. Next. And as years have gone by, and this is the theme about the characters, as much as so many of the creators, the writers, the artists, the publishers of DC, Marvel, other companies throughout the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, even to today, were Jewish, and it absolutely shaped everything, the characters weren't necessarily. They might not be religious at all, but they weren't necessarily Jewish. When you hit the 70s, and especially 80s, and especially now, where everything is up for grabs. So everyone is far more specific on what their profession is, their background, their fallibility, their mental health issues, their religion. So now there's much about the embrace of being Jewish for some of these characters, as we see from Magneto. Next slide. So in one of the movies from 2 decades ago, almost now, a decade and a half, there's a very visual scene of Magneto as a child in Auschwitz. Next. We also learn, as time goes by, Kitty Pryde, who is a member of the X-Men. So the X-Men are mutants. They are humans who have these mutant powers of various degrees. Magneto's the enemy mutant who's declared war on non-mutants, and the X-Men are the mutants who are trying to save the non-mutants like us, assuming all of us are non-mutants. Kitty Pryde is one of the members. And as she talks about, she goes, I don't look or sound Jewish, whatever that looks or sounds like. But again, look at the year of what this is, 2013. But next slide. She came out, so to speak, in another way in the early 80s. Again, see the time frame we're talking about, where in the late 70s, early 80s, there's a greater embrace. So she's fighting this vampire-like guy, and he's talking about how, as we all know, right, silver bullets kill werewolves, crosses are used against the vampires, but the cross doesn't work against this guy. So he jumps at Kitty Pryde and he grabs her and he starts to burn. Why? She's wearing a Jewish star. So apparently that's what he was able to be stopped by. Next slide. No surprise, the writer of these stories, Chris Claremont, is Jewish. So there was this impetus towards it. This particular issue is a visit to the Smithsonian here in Washington, D.C., where I am, and a Holocaust convention where they're all talking about having survivors present and experiences. And Kitty Pryde is there and Magneto is there. But again, the influence from Chris Claremont. Next slide. In D.C. as well, the second Batwoman. The original was from the 50s, as I recall, I think when she first appeared. In the modern revival, she's Jewish, hence the menorah that you see in the top frame. Next slide. The Hulk, who many of us know, again, Kirby and Stan Lee, early 60s, 1962. This character, Samson, on the left, he first appeared in 1968, 69, but by decades later, it turns out he's Jewish as well. He talks about going to a yeshiva. In the next slide, in the next frame, if you can bring it back, he's giving a story to a class about Hanukkah. But it wasn't until literally, 2.5 decades later that it became known that the character was Jewish. Next slide. Moon Knight, you might, if you have Disney Plus, this was a TV series on Disney Plus a year or two ago. Moon Knight, Mark Spector, the first issue came out in 1980. By 4 years later, Alan Zelenitz, Jewish, we learned that Mark Spector's family were Holocaust survivors from the Czechoslovakia region, fled from Hitler, and he grew up in New York City. And you see a very rabbinical looking, Orthodox Jewish man as his father. And I think Mark is wearing a yarmulke, if I see that correctly. Next slide. Danny mentioned showing the first appearance, the first issue of Fantastic Four. No indication of anything in particular. Next slide. But decades later, we learn that Ben Grimm, Grimm, the Thing, who grew up in the Bowery, is Jewish. He comes back to his old haunt and he meets this store owner who he knew as a kid, and he talks about, the words are too small here, but he talks about how he had been picked on as a Jew, as a young Jewish kid. And he's always about boxing, as so many Jews were, especially back in Brooklyn and Queens, and where my family came from as well, after immigrating from Europe, and how proud he is of his Jewish faith. So proud, of course, next slide, that he goes through his own bar mitzvah. No indication of whether he was bar mitzvahed when he was 13. I presume not, since he's not 83 there, although he's almost could be 60 something, depending on what year this was by the creation, but I think he's probably in his 30s as a character. Next slide. Danny mentioned a little bit about Spider-Man. When I lecture on this, I bring this up as I go through all the characters, and then I go, this young man, Peter Parker from Queens, not Jewish, just knew a lot of Jews. Next slide. And these ones to make it obvious. Next slide. We have Sabra, an Israeli superhero on this Hulk issue from 1980, as I recall. Sabra Man. in this publication that I have never seen before. Danny or Raphael can comment on it if they know anything about him. Next one. Very obvious. Some of these characters we talked about already. Kitty Pryde, Mark Spector as Moon Knight, The Thing, and they're at a Happy Holidays theme party, clearly of Hanukkah. Next slide. And then with graphic novels in the last 20, 30 years, but especially in the last 15 years, where whatever topic you want, because now you can self-publish or just create a new publishing company. So the themes are very more obvious than they ever were before. Next slide. And my favorite is Shalom Man, created back in 1985 by a man in Philadelphia named Al Weisner, who actually unfortunately passed away just 2 months ago at the age of 94. Shalom Man is clearly a copyright violation of Superman, but nobody ever bothered going after him. And if someone said oy vey, in trouble, he would be converted from the Shin Rock and metamorphosized into Shalom Man, he was created by 3 wise men: justice, equity, and wisdom. J-E-W. Jew. I love this character. And Mr. Weisner, thank you for everything you've done. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Raphael for his presentation. And I neglected to unfortunately say that, of course, he is the founding director of the David S. Wyman Institute of Holocaust Studies here in DC, although he has defected outside of DC for his daily life. Raphael.
Thanks, Mark, and thank you, Olivia, Matthew, Danny. Holocaust education in America is a relatively new phenomenon. Sometimes we forget that it was only taught in public schools widely in recent decades. Some of our major institutions and cultural representations of the Holocaust are also relatively recent. For example, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington was established only in 1993. Schindler's List was released in 1994. So how did young Americans, how did the younger generation learn about the Holocaust in the years before that, when they weren't learning in school and when it wasn't widely shown in movies or in other venues? When we look back into comic book history, we find a number of indications that the vacuum of Holocaust education in the first decades after the Nazi genocide was filled in some instances by comic books. Earlier, Danny Fingerroth showed you this image of the first issue of Captain America, 1941, with the hero punching Adolf Hitler. This was not a story about the Holocaust. During the World War II years, there were many comic books that had superheroes fighting the Nazis, but those were not comic books that portrayed the mass murder of the Jews, even though during the course of the war, during the Holocaust years, information about the mass killing did gradually reach the mass media and the public, and of course our government. Yet comic books did not portray the persecution of the Jews, even when they were showing Nazis and having American superheroes battling the Nazis. In the immediate years after World War II, there wasn't much public interest in the subject of the Holocaust. Once the Nuremberg trials were finished in the late 1940s, generally speaking, the subject of the Holocaust was not widely discussed, not even in the American Jewish community, and so comic books generally followed along, with some notable exceptions. So here, for example, we're going to be looking at a page from a comic book in 1951. It's a war comic. Just like there are superhero comics, there are comics of other genres, westerns, horror, mystery, and there are war comics. That's a natural setting for a story that might touch on the Holocaust. This very early reference, notice it's 1951, so it's 6 years after the war, when we find our first reference in a mainstream comic book. the final panel in this story, you see a very graphic description, a very graphic portrayal of the Nazis' victims. This was a story about the Nazi general Rommel. So in the course of describing his role in the Nazi hierarchy, this story made a rather brief reference to the Holocaust. So it wasn't much, but it was something. In the years to follow, again, we occasionally would see references to the Holocaust, although interestingly, not always acknowledging that Jews were the primary victims. Here we have a comic book from 1952. It's called Stamps Comics because this publication was linked to the issuing of new postage stamps around the world. In 1952, the Polish government issued a stamp commemorating the Nazi death camp Majdanek, which was on Polish soil. And in conjunction with the Polish government releasing that stamp, so this comic included a story of prisoners escaping from Majdanek, although in the story they're never referred to as Jews. This too is rather typical of the era, when the 1950s in the United States was a time when there was a general mood of not emphasizing ethnic or religious differences, a kind of a get along to go along attitude, and many American Jews also felt uncomfortable about emphasizing their identity, their concerns, their history. In the next scene, we see the first comic book story that really focuses on the fact that Jews were, in fact, the primary victims of the Holocaust. This story, Master Race, has actually become quite famous in comic book history for a variety of reasons, but for our discussion today, what's significant is that finally in 1955, 10 years after the Holocaust ended and the Nazi death camps were liberated, we see the first full story dealing with, in this case, it's dealing with a Nazi war criminal and a Holocaust survivor, and in the pages to follow, there are multiple scenes of Nazis persecuting Jews. So in many ways, this was a breakthrough moment in mainstream comic books depicting the Holocaust. In our next image, notice we fast forwarded 12 years. Again, an indication that although comic books were beginning to talk about the Holocaust, it took a while. 12 years passed, finally in 1967, in a black and white, a magazine-style comic book called Eerie, a horror-themed comic. We again have a full-length story, in this case about the hideous experiments that the Nazis performed on Jewish victims in the death camps. And in this story, again, the Jewish victims are clearly identified as such. So by the late 1960s, comic books are beginning to take a more open and frank position regarding the Jewish identity of the victims. By the time of the next slide, now we're in the early 1970s, we continue to see ever more accurate and explicit portrayals of the Holocaust. Although, again, I want to emphasize, there were not that many stories like this. We collected them in the volume We Spoke Out, which Mark S.ZAID showed you earlier. In this particular story, again, in a war comic, we see that the artist, Joe Kubert, used actual photos of images from the Holocaust as the background in this opening page to the story, thus lending another very important realistic element to a fictional story, but about something that actually happened in history, and which young Americans, and in those days, the average age of comic book readers was teenagers, young teenagers. Here they were learning about something that was not yet being taught in schools, and there were no museums yet or many films to talk about it, but here it was in the world of comic books, which American youngsters were, of course, reading avidly. The next image is from the same year, 1971, a famous story in the Batman series. Now notice this is a superhero comic. The other examples I've been showing you until now were from horror comics and war comics. Here we have a breakthrough into the world of superheroes, the most popular, of comic books. And in this case, Batman, arguably one of the most popular characters, in this famous story drawn by the late legendary Neil Adams. In the next image, continuing a few years further into the 1970s, we have another war comic with a really striking graphic image on the cover, again by Joe Kubert. Here we have a scene from the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt, and it's the lead into a full story about the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt. Here the writer and the artist invoke a kind of a sort of a stereotype, the idea that the older generation was more passive and acquiesced in the Nazi mass murder process, but that younger Jews in Europe were more likely to want to fight back. And so here at the kind of the classic image, you've got the elderly rabbi staying in the hand. He's holding back the hand of a young Jewish man who is clearly about to throw a flaming bottle at a German tank on the street below. 1976. Again, we're still early in terms of Holocaust education in America. Even in the mid-70s, it still wasn't being taught in most schools. In the next image, in 1979, we see, again, a mainstream superhero taking on the Nazis, but not merely punching Hitler in the nose as he did in 1941, but in this issue of Captain America, our hero bursts into a Nazi death camp, fictionally called Diebenwald. There was no such camp, although there were, of course, other camps with similar names like Buchenwald. And Captain America, rather improbably, both beats back the Nazis and rescues a group of Jewish prisoners. But the point is, here again, young Americans were learning about the Holocaust through a medium that they already enjoyed, mainstream superhero comics, at a time when American society as a whole was just starting to catch up with the fact that this was something that America needed to face. And the final image that I want to share with you, we return to the subject of the X-Men, which both Danny and Mark spoke about earlier. This is the first issue in which the character Magneto was revealed to have this background connected to Auschwitz. And notice again, 1981. So the 1960s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and into the 80s were a period when comic books were arguably playing a somewhat pioneering role in bringing the subject of the Holocaust to the attention of young Americans. Thank you.
Great. So
Thank
before I turn the floor back to Mark to moderate your questions, I'm going to make some announcements. And one announcement I want to make is that I also wrote a very small article connected to this subject. We have a graphic novel here that we published at the Sousa Mendes Foundation called Aristides de Sousa Mendes, Hero of the Holocaust. And in conjunction with that, I published an article called The Holocaust Cartoon No Longer Taboo in a Holocaust education journal called Prism. And so Emil, our intern, will put the link into the chat if you're interested in reading what I wrote. So now let me tell you a little bit about what we have upcoming here at the Sousa Mendes Foundation. And while I'm doing that, if you have more questions to put into the chat box, please do so. And it's also Mark's opportunity to gather the questions that are already there to ask of our panelists. So we have one more program of this spring season, and that's coming up in 2 weeks on June 22nd, where we're going to be bringing in Ephraim Zuroff from Israel. He's the head of the Simon Wiesenthal Center there, and there's a film about him called The Last Nazi Hunter. So we're going to have him in dialogue with Dr. Mordechai Paldiel, who speaks on many of our programs. He's on our board of directors. He was at Yad Vashem for many years as the director of the Department for the Righteous. And they're going to speak about basically the lack of justice of these perpetrators of the Holocaust, how so many of them got away scot-free, and how it fell to Nazi hunters such as Zuroff such as the Klarsfeld couple in Paris, such as Simon Wiesenthal himself and others, to bring these people to the attention of local law enforcement and bring them to justice. It's a fascinating program. I'm sure you won't want to miss it. And then I'm going to tell you about one more program. And then after that, we'll see a trailer for The Last Nazi Hunter. So June 22nd, as I said, is that program. Then we take a little break with our Sunday programs. The reason being that I'm taking a group of 18 teachers to Portugal for our first ever Educators Institute in residence at the new Sousa Mendes Museum in Portugal. It's very exciting. We have 16 American teachers, 2 Portuguese teachers, and I can't wait. But when I come back from that, we'll do our next program, which is on July 27th. And that will be on the topic of Danish rescue, the really important story of the rescue of the Jewish community of Denmark, almost the entire Jewish community, which was ferried by ship to Sweden. In the 5 years we've done these Sunday programs, we have not yet focused on Denmark, and I'm so excited to present this story to you. We have a survivor himself, born in Copenhagen. We have the curator at the Museum of Jewish Heritage who organized the fabulous exhibit now on view, must-see exhibit about the Danish rescue. And we have a historian joining us from Denmark who is the expert on this story. So now, getting back to the June 22nd program, let's see a little trailer of the film, The Last Nazi Hunter.
Send people to the river to be murdered. It's not business as usual if someone like Capiro, against whom there is so much evidence, and it's so clear what he did, and he's so guilty that this is a person who shouldn't be allowed to live his life in peace and tranquility, and he has to pay for the crime. I'm sure you're all wondering where this Shandor Capiro lives. Well, why don't you all just look outside the window across the street at that apartment building? That's where he lives.
Okay, so that's what we have coming up. Now, Mark, take it away for the audience questions, please.
Awesome. Thank you, Olivia. And that film looks really interesting. We have several really good questions, and let me start with it. So the first one that Deborah asked was about how Siegel and Schuster were treated by DC, because there is a lot of controversy surrounding how they were. Danny mentioned they sold the rights to Superman for $130. That was $10 per page. It was a 13-page story. Now, I will say, in my view, and it's something I'm starting to talk about a lot more, I don't think it was as bad as it has been portrayed to be. I think some of it has to be understood in the context of the time. Everything back then was work for hire. So you would draw, you would write, and you would sell it. And then it would be owned by the companies. That was how it was done. We can debate whether nowadays, should it have been done that way. In the same way we could say slavery was not a good thing back then, but you got to take into account in the climate. We look at our founding fathers, and all of whom pretty much had slaves, but we recognize it in the context of the time. Siegel and Schuster got paid double what everyone else was being paid for. And they actually made a ton of money into the 1940s. At one time in about 1942-3, Jerry Siegel had earned about $750,000 in today's dollars for that time, about $50,000. He lost it all for a variety of reasons. He got mistreated, both of them. It was mostly Siegel, and they ended up suing multiple times, including way past their lifetimes for their families having sued. It is a fascinating story, and I'll end with saying this. Hopefully, I will be doing a panel discussion at the Baltimore Comic-Con in October about this, because I own a lot of letters that Jerry Siegel sent in the 1950s to the officers of D.C., who were Jewish, Leibowitz and Donenfeld, but they were New York Jews versus Cleveland Jews. Very different attitudes. And these letters would amaze you. They're very threatening. They're very, I have one that says in like big capital letters, which is usually the letters I get from prisoners all the time as a lawyer. It's like, today is Father's Day. You have ruined my life. You know, and that, like, literally that's the whole letter that he sent to the folks at DC. All right. It's a big story. The next question, let me go and just find it, is from Jeremy. Danny, I'm going to ask you to take, nope, sorry, not Jeremy. Sorry. Or maybe Jeremy asked multiple questions. Sorry, now I'm reading through it. Here it is. The first one I'm going to have, and I'm going to have you, Danny, do it. So, Captain America Brave New World was a rather disappointing movie with the respect to the way that the character Sabra, who I showed the pictures of, was treated. And it was an Israeli actress who played her in this movie. As recently as December 2024, the exceptional X-Men issue number 4, clearly, Jeremy, I love it, you are still into comics here, is featuring Kitty Pryde celebrating Hanukkah on the cover. To what extent is the industry seeing Jewish erasure, both in terms of representation in stories as well as representation among creators? To what extent do we think this is a reflection of growing modern anti-Semitism? And or should there be doing anything to combat this? Obviously, the answer is yes to that part. But how about, Danny, in trying to address that, how much in the industry is Jewish representation among the publishers and authors and creators, etc.?
Well, as we've just shown, it's pretty commonplace, and the idea really that World War II has never stopped being fought in the pages, especially of Marvel Comics, I think is as true as ever. I don't believe there's Jewish erasure. I don't buy it. I think this character Sabra, because of who she was, I guess some people were hoping she would be an embodiment of some kind of Jewish values, but they didn't. I just think they didn't feel like they wanted that. That was not the story they wanted to tell. Is that erasure? If every story or every character who could possibly be Jewish is not wholly portrayed as Jewish, I don't know. I think there's plenty of Jewish characters in the Marvel movies. I get the feeling that sometimes some of the DC movies are literally public relations for Christianity for different reasons. That comes and goes with the various deals. I don't know. The Thing is Jewish. Kitty Pryde is Jewish. They seem to be Jewish in the movies and TV shows. So, I guess the premise is not one I agree with, although I know a lot of people feel that way.
And Raphael, Susan asks, how did the way comics treated the Holocaust influence or affect how Holocaust education developed in public schools in the United States?
I'm not aware of any obvious connection. The comic book examples that I showed, Superman, Captain America, Batman, and the others, I never heard of them being used in classrooms back in the 70s, although they would have made for excellent curriculum material at the time. We know that a lot of American teens were reading those stories, but not because their teachers were introducing them to them. So things have changed a lot. Today, it's commonplace for teachers to use comic books, graphic novels, and other types of graphic art in the course of talking about history and a variety of subjects. But I don't think I'm not aware of any use of those materials back to 20, 30, 40 years ago.
And Diane asks about what kind of pushback did the comic book creators face, if any? Were there consequences for their honesty? I'll start to say that at least historically, for one thing, the reason why there were so many Jews involved in the comic book industry, it was because we were banned, prohibited from, biased against, discriminated against in the other industries. So instead of going into advertising or movies, and well, movies, there was a lot, but predominantly advertising, they went into the comic book community. If anything, they hid not necessarily their Jewishness, but they did. They changed a lot of their names for sure. But they usually were kind of hiding that they were even in comic books, because being in comic books wasn't necessarily a cool thing back in the 30s and your 40s, right? Your mom is not that proud that, you're not a doctor, you're not a lawyer, you're a comic book writer. Come on. But Danny, you started in the 70s inside the Marvel comic book world. Did you ever see any type of anti-Semitism inside the industry itself?
Um, I think it was an average kind of workplace. You would have some people who were obsessed with the fact that I was Jewish or other people were Jewish. But bottom line, I think it was more almost like some guys thought they were Don Rickles. They thought that they could joke about it, and you would sort of have to take it if you wanted to be a good sport. But then they would joke about somebody's color or somebody's what they were wearing or what they ate for lunch. Um, I think there was just a generalized concern, especially in the days of the Comics Code, that anybody we would portray as being a particular religion or a particular nationality would risk alienating other parts of the audience. So I think but that was loosening up, and thanks a lot, in great part, to people like Chris Claremont and John Byrne. I'm leaving out lots of people. The idea was these were people you interacted with in life, and they should be represented in the stories. But it took a long time. I mean, that was sort of a lot of my book, disguised as Clark Kent, and Ari Kaplan's book and other people's books, is finding that Holocaust survivor code in Captain America. And I'm the guy who found the Jewish content of the Mighty Thor. If you read my book, you'll see it. But I mean, clearly this was not stuff that was intentionally put in. Maybe Mad would sprinkle in some Yiddish words or something. But I think given the nature of who was making these comics and when they were making them, you'd look back and take sort of a psychological, a sociological view of what they did, and you go, oh, well, of course, these were coded Jewish messages and characters.
And Jeanette is asking about an exhibit that was on Jewish cartoons at the Skirball Museum in Los Angeles, and whether any of us had anything to do with it. I did not. I will say that there have been many, and I'll turn to you guys to see if you had. There have been many really cool Jewish exhibits of comic book history, particularly in New York. We just had one finish here at the Lillian and Albert Small Museum of history of DC Jews, where the tragic shooting was recently. In fact, I spoke at the museum just a month or two ago about this exact topic of what we're doing here. Guys, did you have anything to do?
Jump in here a second. Yeah, I was one of the curators of that exhibition.
There you go.
And it started at the Center for Jewish History in New York. It's called JEWC, JEWC, the Jewish Comics Experience. And it's traveling all over the country. It just finished, as you said, in DC. I'm not sure where it's going next, but it's got at least 3 or 4 more venues around the country. And JEWC was a sort of an offshoot of the Jewish Comics Experience, Jewish Comic Con, which had 2 iterations at the Center for Jewish History in late 2003 and late 2024. It's a little bit in limbo now, but I'm hoping we'll have some exciting announcements about where and when it'll be happening again. And it certainly is available to travel to other venues if somebody wants to have a Jewish branded Jewish Comic Con.
Wonderful. So we're getting to the end of the hour, and I know, Danny, we wanted to show images of some of your books, so maybe we can pull that up. And
Had to
Danny,
twist my arm.
if there's anything you'd like to say in closing, now is the time.
Um, well, those are those are three of my books. By the way, if you've enjoyed hearing me talk here, I've done audiobooks of all those books. So just imagine 14 hours of me talking in your ear. Um, Disguised as Clark Kent is Jewish comics and the creation of the superhero. If you look online, there's a very funny picture of the late comedian Gilbert Gottfried posing with my book. A Marvelous Life, The Amazing Story of Stan Lee. Stan, one of the reasons I chose to write a biography of Stan, who I worked with and knew, was because it's a very typical Jewish comic creator's evolution and development. And Jack Ruby, of course, was the guy who killed Lee Harvey Oswald, for better or worse. That too is a very Jewish story. I spoke to many people, including a rabbi named Hillel Silverman, who was Jack's rabbi, and visited him. He was the father of the actor Jonathan Silverman of Weekend at Bernie's. You may say, what connection does Jack Ruby have to comic books? Well, A, it started as a graphic novel project. B, here's a story about Jack Ruby that Jack Kirby drew in Esquire magazine in 1967. So there's more connections than you might think. The only other thing I wanted to say was, we just touched the tip of the iceberg today. Read all our books, read my book, Raphael's, Ari's. There's a lot to this story, the novel Cavalier and Clay. There's a lot to the Jewish aspect of comics.
And
Okay.
I'll take that. And Matt, if you could put the end of my slides, I'll just really quickly, just as a demonstration of what else is out there on this topic. Most of these books, not surprisingly, about the Jewish relationship to comics are written within the last 15 years. And if you've got that, or I'll tell you while you get that, I'll tell you why don't we turn to Raphael for any final comments that Raphael wants to make, and then we'll get Matt, if you can still bring up my slides while you do that.
Okay, thanks. As a historian, naturally, I think that Holocaust education is necessary and important. And I'm very glad that in most states in the US today, it's mandatory in our high schools and often in middle schools as well. But I don't see Holocaust education as an antidote to anti-Semitism. I think the proof of that is what's happening on college campuses today. Those student protesters who have been calling for the destruction of Israel and endorsing mass killing of Jews by Hamas, they all had Holocaust education. They went to public schools. They learned about what the Nazis did to the Jews. For more than 30 years now, most young Americans have learned about the Holocaust in school, and yet we are experiencing, as we know, the worst outbreak of anti-Semitism in American history, including recently violent, murderous incidents in Pennsylvania and Washington, D.C., and now in Boulder, Colorado. So as important as Holocaust education is, and as grateful as I am to the comics industry for taking on the issue of the Holocaust in its own way, I don't think we should kid ourselves into thinking that teaching about the Holocaust is the answer to anti-Semitism.
Excellent. Thank you. Matt, you able to bring that up real quick, or should I skip? All right, perfect. Let's get that up there. So just so you see, on the 2010, that is a book about Siegel and Schuster and the notion of this character they created back in the 40s that absolutely failed post DC. Next. And then the one book by Danny, but you've got Up and Oy Vey by Simcha Weinstein, is a Hasidic rabbi, I think in Queens, if I remember.
Pratt.
Next.
At Pratt in Brooklyn.
Brooklyn? Okay, thanks. Next one, Matt. A couple other, there's the book Ari Kaplan that Danny mentioned. Then someone had asked about animation. So Jews and American Comics goes much more into not just comic books, but all sorts of animation and illustration. And is there another? I think there's another one, right? Somebody asked me about Superman being circumcised. I don't know if you were asking that totally as a joke, but here's the book for you to answer the question, which is protected by HIPAA.
It's a terrific book.
What's the answer?
It's privacy protected. Cannot say.
Okay.
Well, with that, we'll turn it back over. And if I will say, if anyone has any further questions, you can always reach out to us, especially through the foundation, and we would be happy to address anything. But thank you for this opportunity. Olivia, I turn it to you to finish.
Yes, the hour has flown by. What a delightful hour, but what a sobering final remark from Raphael. Raphael, I don't know what the answer is. Maybe you have it. If so, please share it with us. We all are living through this horrible time, and we're just all trying to get through it together. So when we have an opportunity to laugh, as we did together today, it's a nice thing. So see you all soon in a couple of weeks for the last Nazi hunter. Be well, everybody. Thank you so much to our wonderful panel and our great audience. Take care. Have a wonderful Father's Day next week, and see you soon. Bye-bye, everybody. Be well.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
Take care.